Hey there, art nerds. Today I invite you to draw and paint along with me. So this tutorial is going to feature a drawing component, an inking component, and a watercolor component. If you're one of my patrons on Patreon and you just want to color along, I also have a printable line art for you at patreon.com/natosoup. I'll have all the materials you'll need linked in the description below as well. So today I am working in my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, and I am beginning my underdrawing with a very light pink lead. So light that my camera is having trouble with it. I'm really sorry for that. I started out by sketching a circle that's going to be our composition, and then I'm kind of filling the circle with different mushroom shapes. I'm referencing several different types of mushrooms on Google. If you're drawing along with me, you can draw whatever kind of mushrooms you particularly like to draw or want to paint, but we have some of those red-capped mushrooms with the little white scales. We also have some enoke style mushrooms, and then we have some smaller mushrooms. Down at the bottom, I'm also sketching in some oval shapes that are going to become moss a little bit later on. Next, I'm sketching in some round circle shapes. I'm going to break those up into flowers. Right now, I'm just trying to kind of capture the composition and the placement of everything. Once I'm happy with the sketch, I erase all the extra lines, and now I'm going to start carefully inking it in using a Pigma FB brush pen. So I'm using this brush pen today for a couple of reasons. One, it has a fairly fine brush, but it's capable of some really expressive line work, so I only have to use one pen to ink this entire thing, and I'll still be able to get a variety of line weights. It's also alcohol marker and waterproof, so whether I wanted to use alcohol markers or watercolor for this, I should be good. And I love the flexibility of that. I love not having to worry about whether or not my inks are going to reactivate. Now, after I finish inking this, I am going to allow it to cure for 24 hours before I begin painting it. Typically, when I'm inking, I start foreground, working my way to background, or I start with the most important thing in the illustration. So if this were an illustration with people in it, I would start with their faces first. And the reason for that is if I wear out my hand, if my hand starts to get tired and starts to cramp up, at least the faces, which are going to be the most noticeable if you make a mistake, those will be handled, and everything else will be far less noticeable, are much easier to kind of correct. Now, one downside to this method is I can't just go in with whiteout. I can't just go in with like Copic opaque white at this point in time, because if I paint on top of it, it's going to be even more noticeable than the mistake originally was. So even if I make a mistake, I either try to gently kind of adjust the inks to accommodate that, or I may draw something on top of it, or I just go ahead and, as hard as it can be, move on and try to fix that later on when we're adding our watercolor. So with our moss, I wanted to have a bunch of different textures, and anytime you see me drawing something, even if it's something like a composition like this that's from imagination, I'm usually working pretty heavily from reference, because even though I have a cartoonier art style, I still want things to look like what they're supposed to look like. So I would recommend, if there's anything you want to draw, go ahead and look it up and work from those photos, or work from other artists whose work you enjoy. So I talked about inking faces first, but this illustration doesn't have any faces. So I'm working from foreground to background. And the reason for this is it's really easier to ink the things that are going to overlap other things first and just kind of work your way to the back. This will also allow you to adjust your line weight as needed. You may decide that the objects in your foreground, the ones closest to your viewer, need a heavier line weight that might make them seem like they're heavier or more important or more noticeable. That may make the viewer feel like those objects are closer to them. You may decide that like the undersides of the mushroom caps, for example, should have a heavier line weight because that would be the area in shadow, and that's going to imply shadow. You might decide that the exterior lines on the exterior of the mushrooms need a heavier line weight than the interior lines, because that's going to unify the form and group it as a single object and make it easier for the eye to parse. You may decide that the objects in the foreground need more details on them because they're closer to the viewer and the viewer would be able to see all those details than the objects in the background, which would be further away and would make the details a little bit more difficult to see. You have all kinds of options and all kinds of decisions to make when you're inking. So I recommend practicing. Try a variety of different methods and start putting together the techniques that you find work the best for you and for the kind of illustration that you like to create. If you're looking for some more tips on atmospheric perspective, I have some tutorials that I did as part of my Making Comics and Zines series, and I'll try to remember to link those for you guys in the description below. So when I'm inking, in order to ink successfully and to have my hands not be all shaky, I want to try to ink from my shoulder down. So I want the movements to be as big as possible and use as much of my arm as possible. At the minimum, it should be from the elbow down. So you want to clear off your drawing space. You want to have plenty of room to work. And you also want to twist and turn your illustration as much as you need to get the angles that you want. I also try to control my breathing while I'm inking because that allows me to pull cleaner lines in one go. So it's actually very hard for me to talk to people while I'm inking because that's going to mess up my line work and I don't want that to happen. So often I'll refrain from answering questions until I finished inking the segment that I was working on. And just make sure you give yourself the time it needs to be inked. Don't try to rush it. Just kind of sink in and enjoy it the way you might with watercolor. So once I finished inking it, I scanned it and I also allowed it to dry onto the paper for at least 24 hours. I'm also kind of reinforcing that circle in the background so that I can see it a little bit better. So we're starting with the moss in the foreground, and I already have a color palette in mind. We're going to have some warm blues, we're going to have some really bright reds, and we're going to have some mossy greens. And I don't want all the mossy greens to just look like the same green. I want these to be apparent as different patches of moss, not just from the line work and the way I handled the line art for these, but also for the colors. So for the patches you guys saw me just paint, and I'm using round watercolor brushes and quills for this one. I started out with a cool yellow. Then for the long shaggy one in the back, I used a green gold. And then for the ones you guys see me working on right now, I'm starting with Hooker's green. And these are really simple watercolor illustrations. They are just going to be mostly local color without a whole lot of shadow, and we're going to really just focus on the saturation of color and moving the colors towards cooler colors to create the sense of shadow and depth. So the resulting illustration is going to be really vibrant, really fun, and really pop, but you don't really have to worry about color theory for this one. So for the moss, I have moved on to a slightly more saturated version of our green gold just by mixing more paint into the brush. And then for some of the larger patches in the background, I've started to mix in some Hooker's green for that. I also want my brush strokes to kind of reflect the texture of the moss. So for the moss that has like longer fibers, I'm using longer brush strokes. And then for the moss that has kind of like shorter, more carpet-like fibers, I'm using shorter brush strokes. Now, something I want to mention here is this took about an evening to paint, a relaxed evening, about 4 hours, including dry times. I am not including the dry times in this time lapse, and this has been sped up by 4x. So this did not take 30 minutes to paint. It took several hours, including dry time. So if you're painting along at home, give yourself the time it takes to paint. Don't try to rush it. Give the paint time to dry on the paper. I'm working in a cellulose paper sketchbook because it is going to dry a little bit faster so long as my AC is on and the humidity isn't too high. But if you're having problems with the humidity, I know a lot of people recommend the hair dryer. You guys know, not a fan of the hair dryer, especially with a cellulose paper, because you want to wait until you can no longer see the shininess of the water on the paper. And with cellulose paper, by that point, you can already start painting your next layer. So for these patches of moss, as I want to start adding in shadow, I'm working towards a cooler darker, more saturated green. It really doesn't matter what color palette you're working with. You guys see me working with this huge convenience color filled palette. These are just colors that I happen to really like and that I use frequently in my illustration and comics. A good 12 color mixing palette and a little bit of clever color mixing should get you all of the colors and variations that you need to be able to paint along with me today. Once I'm pretty satisfied with the moss, I'm going to start moving on to the mushrooms. And I am applying a really light gray, a mix of burnt umber with a little bit of ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of Payne's gray in there, to the stem and the underside, the gills of many of the mushrooms in the illustration. If I use the wrong terminology, I am so sorry. I do not have the best memory for this, but hopefully you guys can follow along with what I'm saying. This gray is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting today because we're going to be painting most of the stems for this one. And if you guys don't know, I love mushrooms. I think they're beautiful. And I just wanted to create a grouping of mushrooms that almost felt like a floral arrangement. I thought you guys might enjoy that as well. So for our oyster mushrooms in the foreground, we're really going to lean in on that green. The majority, not green, on that gray, the majority of that body color is going to be just various shades of darker gray. So right now I'm just mixing in a little bit more burnt umber, a little bit more ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit more Payne's gray to build up that saturation. I'm also working on a ceramic palette. It's just a plate from Dollar Tree, but I'm using this to mix the colors in my brush so that it's not all water and to ensure we have a pretty good mix on the brush itself. And just to kind of mix up a little bit of extra color so I have enough to go around and I'm not just constantly trying to remix the same mixes or to, approximate the same mixes. We talk a lot about illustrations on cotton rag paper here on this channel, but believe me, I don't do most of my illustration work on cotton rag paper. That's really the most special illustrations that I choose to share with you guys. But the majority of what I do is either in a watercolor sketchbook as studies or practice, or like kind of refined doodles like this, nothing too serious but something for fun, or I do comic pages on Canson Mont Val. So I have spent a lot of time painting on these cheaper papers and they definitely have their place. They're a great way to just kind of start building those watercolor skills, to get watercolor ideas out, and to just have a little bit more fun with it and be a little bit more forgiving. So this is basically a watercolor sketchbook where sometimes I like what I paint and sometimes I don't, and I don't have to share the ones I don't like if I don't want to. So towards the back, we have a large brown mushroom with brown scales on the cap. So I've mixed a little bit more burnt umber into our gray mix to better reflect that color. So I am applying it just kind of all over and then adding some more as shade on the stem of the mushroom as well as on kind of the ruffles. Now, I'm not necessarily waiting for the whole thing to dry completely before I add the next layer, and that way we get some interesting kind of wet into wet going on. We get some interesting color mixing. So I wanted to bring a little bit of brightness, and even with these mushrooms, I'm working heavily from reference. So I am selecting mushrooms that I feel would suit different parts of the illustration. And I felt like a little bit of yellow would work really well. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to use some masking fluid to go ahead and mask out the scales on the red-capped mushrooms. So I'd applied a little bit of my gray earlier on, and that's just going to be kind of the shadow on those scales. So once that dried, I'm applying my masking fluid, and I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry completely before I start painting the caps. So one of the beautiful things about working from reference rather than just straight up from your imagination is you will often see color variations that your memory maybe won't quite capture. So for these red cap mushrooms, I noticed that they are more orange towards the center and towards the top, and then redder towards the edges, and that's something I want to replicate using wet and to wet here. So I'm applying some Chinese orange and then dabbing in some new gamboge. Then while it's still wet, or as close to still wet as I can get, I'm going to start dabbing in some scarlet red, encouraging it to mix together and kind of blend. So with a cellulose paper like this, you're not going to get the cleanest, nicest wet and to wet blends, but we're not really going for that. We're kind of going for the chaos. That's really what we're looking for, and for it to give us kind of the characteristics of watercolor. Now I'm working in a cooler red towards the edges and towards the bottom of the cap, just to kind of give that beautiful definition and so that we can see that beautiful color variation. So for this brown cap mushroom, I'm doing an all over fill with burnt umber. And then I'm going to let that dry and kind of start extending that into the stem so that we have this kind of shaded area. I'm going to blend that out with a little bit of clean water as well. Once that's dried, I'm going to mix in a darker brown using Van Dyke brown with a little bit of sepia and start painting the details on the cap. And while I did ink some of those scales in, I'm also freehanding some of those scales as well, just to kind of continue the beautiful ombre and color gradation effect that we have on the cap. I'm going to work in a little bit more of the sepia towards the top because the reference shows that it gets darker towards the top, and I really like that, and I really want to bring that into this illustration. So for our red cap mushrooms, I'm grabbing some more scarlet and painting that all over the cap, and that's just going to add some more saturation to those caps, make them a little bit more vibrant. I'm also adding in a little bit of alizarin crimson as well. That's a red that's trending more cool. So we're going to still have some of that really nice red and vibrancy, but we're also going to start implying some shadow. So moving towards the cooler version of a color can also help imply that it's moving towards shadow, or that it's moving away from the light source, like with the little red cap mushroom at the bottom, where it has this kind of ball-shaped cap. For the large brown mushroom in the background, I want to start adding in the gill details using a slightly more saturated brown than what we were using on the stem. And I'm just doing little repetitive straight line. Well, they're not really straight, they're kind of curved lines curving towards the stem. If you're painting along with me, you are free to make whatever modifications you want to make. You can jump off at any point when you're satisfied. I'm going to add another layer of saturation to the caps of the mushroom. And what you guys just saw was me using a bottle of Korean watercolor glue just to kind of hold the page down while it dries, to help prevent it from curling so much, so that everything can kind of dry flat. That's another kind of downside with these sketchbooks, is you may want to use a binder clip or some kind of weights to kind of weigh it down while you're painting. So for these little yellow mushrooms, I am adding a layer of Indian yellow and then dabbing in some sepia at the bottom, wet into wet, to encourage it to kind of blend upwards so that we get that beautiful color transition from kind of that beautiful yellow color to the darker brown. I'm going to give everything a chance to dry once I finish painting these mushrooms, and then I'm going to mix up a larger wash of ultramarine blue with a little bit of French cerulean blue in this sauce cup here. And I'm going to use this to paint the background circle. I had basically waited until the end to decide what color I wanted to use for the background, because I wanted it to really work with the painting, and I wasn't 100% sure what that would be, whether it was going to be a cooler blue or a warmer blue, until I finished painting it. But I decided to go with the sort of beautiful blue that you get on a sunny, summery day, where it's just like that endless forever blue. And the way I like to mix that is either ultramarine blue with phthalo blue or ultramarine blue with French cerulean blue. And I wanted a little bit of that granulation, so I went with the cerulean blue because that's going to add some additional granulation to our ultramarine blue. And I am both resting my wrist on my other hand and holding down the curl of the page. So it's doing double duty there, but I'm resting my hand on my wrist to act as like a painter's bridge or a painter's maul so that I'm not dragging my hand in wet watercolor. I decided I want to do another layer of the blue and get it more intense and darker, so I add in some more ultramarine blue and some more cerulean blue, and I just start doing it again. And my recommendation for this is we're working in discrete sections, and that's going to give us the effect of kind of like a seamless streak-free painting on a paper that can sometimes be a little bit temperamental to paint on. If you're painting along with me, this is your reminder to take your time and be patient with yourself. This has been, again, sped up 4x. I don't paint this fast. I don't expect anybody else to paint this fast, so please be patient with yourself. I'm going to use a couple of glass bottles as weights while it dries so that it can dry flatter rather than as curled as it was. And now I'm just kind of going in and painting the flowers. So I had held off on the flowers because I wasn't quite sure if I wanted them to be white with yellow centers or yellow with darker yellow centers. But I decided to do yellow with darker yellow centers just as a bit of a contrast and a little bit of a pop to the colors that we already have here. I'm also going to make some adjustments to the mushrooms in the background just to, kind of keep finessing them and keep tweaking them because look, I just can't leave well enough alone is usually the answer. I wanted the caps on these little yellow and brown mushrooms to be a little bit more orange. So for some of them, I went with New Gamboge, and for the flowers, I did a really light yellow, and now I'm going in with a mid yellow. And basically what I mean by this is I'm trying not to just use the color names because we don't all have the same palette. And some of these colors are not a universal color. Some of these are convenience colors that I've added because they are useful for the mixes that I like to make. So when I say a cool yellow, I mean a yellow trending towards green. If I say a warm yellow, I mean a yellow trending towards orange. So once I've got my flowers kind of blocked in, I want to add a little bit more blue, particularly to the top of our circle. Again, really trying to give the impression of that warm, summery sky. At this point, we've got our colors mostly blocked in, so I'm just going to be kind of finessing and adjusting things, maybe adding some more Van Dyke brown to the cap of the brown mushroom, adding in some more shadows, things like that. It's really up to your taste, your eye, and how your painting is going as to how much detail and how much you want to change things up or refine things. So a little bit of honesty here. I find these time-lapse videos challenging to narrate sometimes. They move so fast that it's hard for my brain and my mouth to keep up with what my hands are doing. Sometimes it's easier to write it up, or I can write it up in more detail in a blog post. But I have to say, doing these time-lapse videos over the years, you'd think it would get easier, but it has only gotten harder. So I wanted to reinforce some of the shadows. So I'm just kind of going in with the local color, more saturated, and just adding in more shadows, adding in more lines. I also wanted to add some more dark brown, some more sepia to the cap of the brown mushroom in the background. Basically, I'm at the point where I do a thing, I let it dry, I see how I feel about it. Maybe I walk away and get a glass of water, or I get a snack, come back, think about it, make some changes here and there. So that's another reason why I really want to impress that art takes time, because often our eyes need to adjust, our brain needs to adjust, and frankly, the paint on the paper need to dry because often the colors don't look the same after they dried, and you need to give yourself time to kind of reassess and kind of figure out what you're going to do with it. So once everything dried, and that doesn't take too long with cellulose paper, I am using a masking fluid frisket to pick up the masking fluid off of our red capped mushrooms. I'm also using my wrist as a bridge so that I'm not, rubbing my wrist on the actual illustration itself. I'm just going to go back in with a little bit of Scarlet and kind of clean up those edges. I don't know about you guys, but I have so much trouble controlling masking fluid, and it often wants to blob more than I really want it to. So once I've lifted it up, I know I'm going to have to make some corrections. I'm good with that. I'm just wondering if that's like a me thing or if it's something that other people struggle with. But other than that, I am finished. Thank you guys so much for joining me for today's 3-in-1 watercolor tutorial. I hope you guys found it helpful, useful, and informative. If you are an amazing, awesome patron on Patreon, I have the line art for you guys. Just as a small thanks for all of the support that you've given me. It really means a lot to me and I really appreciate it. Keep an eye out because I have a few more tutorials that are 3-in-1 tutorials that I hope you guys will enjoy, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again really soon.